Campside Media.
Hey, Campside listeners, welcome back to Inside the Tent, our show where we go behind the scenes of our favorite podcasts and talk to the people who brought them to life. My name is Adam Hoff, and I'm one of the co-founders here at Campside Media. Today, I'm talking to one of our other founders, Josh Dean, about Hooked, an Apple original podcast he hosted back in 2021. Unlike my three co-founders, my background is in TV and film, so a lot of my favorite podcasts are the ones that take on a cinematic tone. And probably nothing we've made was more immediately cinematic than the story of a Boeing engineer somehow becoming a prolific bank robber. However, to my surprise, it was the intimacy of audio that made the project a true standout. If you want more exclusive content or behind-the-scenes anecdotes from our shows, make sure to go to joincampside.com to become a free member of the Campside community. That's joincampside.com. Now sit back and enjoy my conversation with Josh. This was obviously one of my favorite podcasts that we've made, and one we've talked a lot about over the years. And I think it was like part of the origin story of Campsite, if I remember correctly. So obviously this wasn't a conventional journey to a podcast. This was a magazine article initially. Can you tell the listeners how you came about this story, how you found it, reported it, just the whole journey?
Yeah, so this has happened a few times now at Campsite, but I guess this is the first example of, we've had cases like Suspect where a magazine story led to a podcast, but the two things were unrelated. Hooked was a magazine story that I wrote for Bloomberg Business Week in, I think, 2018, a year before we started talking about Campsite and actually writing the Google Doc that would become the company. And Bloomberg did an issue every year called the Heist issue, which was a fun themed issue. I've always loved heists. It's one of my favorite genres of magazine story. And editor-in-chief came to me and said, do you have any heist stories? I can't remember what I'd done the year before. I did something they liked the year before. And they were like, what do you want to do this year? And I didn't have one in mind. And this is funny. This is really journalism backwards. I started thinking like, it would be fun to write about an objectively successful bank robber. What does it mean to be a successful bank robber? How do you become a successful bank robber? How successful has someone out there been? And so I think I literally started searching for most bank robberies or like most prolific bank robbers. And I landed on this story from the Seattle Times, whatever the Seattle newspaper is, about a guy named Conner Hathaway who had robbed 30 banks in 54 weeks, that's quite a resume. That's almost a bank every week and a half, I think. It's furious work. And I can't definitively prove that it's the most banks in a calendar year, but I'm almost positive that it is. So I was like, oh, this is interesting. I need to write to this guy. And what's crazy is the story in the Seattle paper it was like not a feature. It was, this man was arrested. He'd been spotted at a casino. It's suspected that like addiction and gambling may have played a role. And that was really it. It was not like a profile of who he was. It didn't tell much of his story. So I thought I was just writing to a guy who was really good at bank robbery and then got caught. And I wrote to him in prison, and a couple weeks later, I got a letter back that I actually read this in, I think, the first episode of Hooked, where he jumped right into it and was like, I don't know how much you know about my story, but I was an airplane designer at Boeing. I injured my back. I had surgery. My doctor prescribed OxyContin. I ended up addicted to heroin, homeless, robbing banks. And so I was like, holy shit, this is not what I thought I was writing about. And you have to put yourself in like 2017, 2018 shoes. There hadn't been the big boom of opiate journalism. Of course, we all knew about the crisis, but it wasn't like Dopesick hadn't come out yet, I don't think. Maybe Sam Quinonez's book had come out. But there wasn't like a whole canon of opiate journalism. So I was just like, this is an amazing heist story that's actually the story of the opiate epidemic. And I went to see Tony, and this is always the proof of whether a story is there or not, like how forthcoming is the subject willing to be. And I went out to Washington State and went to prison and met him. And he was just like the openest book I've ever encountered from like the minute we met. And I think I probably told you this back when it happened, but that Washington State prisons do not allow you to record or take notes. So journalists can visit subjects in prison, but you can't write anything down or record it. So you might ask, like, how useful is that? It was like really useful for meeting him. But what we did is he got a game, and I can't remember what game it was, but it was one of the games that has scorecards and pencils. So we pretended to be playing a game, and I took all my first notes on like tiny little, it wasn't Mad Libs, but let's pretend it's Mad Libs, like little, and then I smuggled them out of my pocket. So I actually did violate Washington State prison law. I'm sure I'm outside the statute of limitations. And anyway, that's how I met him. And so it turned into this great magazine story. But I always felt like it could be something bigger. It could have been a book. And then when we started Campside, I thought, wow, that story really resonated. Tony was a dynamic character. He's an amazing talker, and he's about to get out of prison. So why don't we make a podcast? And it was on our initial deck. I think we had 10 ideas, 9 of which ultimately became Campside podcasts, and one of those was Hooked. So it wasn't like a retread exactly of the magazine story. I obviously expanded it way beyond where I just told the story of the Boeing engineer who gets addicted to heroin and robs banks and gets caught. That was the magazine story. This was much more inside his relationship with his son, what happened after he got out, struggles of reentry to society, and people seemed to really like it.
Was the game's categories?
It might have been
Balderdash, Yahtzee.
Actually, it may have been Yahtzee. I just keep naming.
Yahtzee felt like it was one of my 3 I wrote down.
I think it could have been Yahtzee. You know what? I think I'm gonna ask Tony. He'll remember. He's got a great memory. It may have been Yahtzee.
I had a question for you, which was like, what was it like to interview somebody in prison, and what were those restrictions? But you already answered it. That obviously kept you from getting usable recording, which you didn't know at the time would be something you'd care about. But what other ways did it restrict your ability to, like, how much more did Tony's story bloom once you got to talk to him freely and without those restrictions?
So much. So I think the reality was he was able to talk so he could send emails. So I knew we could talk that way. And I think, in fact, I'm sure he was able to talk on the phone with restrictions. Like it was like a 1 day a week, I think, and under certain hours, and you can only use it for each inmate got a block of time. So it was more like that visit was to break the ice, to see if we liked each other, for me to figure out whether he was the kind of person who was actually going to talk to me or just be, because I really didn't know him at all. And I thought sometimes people will tell you the story they think you want to hear and not the one that's actually true. But it was pretty obvious he was like super honest. So then we started emailing and then talking. And because it was a print story, I was not yet worried at that time about recordings. In retrospect, how could I have been? I did not know at that time we were going to start a podcast company, or even that I would ever make a podcast. But I developed a rapport with him, and so then I was able to talk to him subsequently. It's really only the in-person part. And it's weird. Why Washington State? Like, why could you not take notes? I don't know curious what the impetus for that rule would be, especially because they let you talk to the people on the phone. It didn't restrict me really. It was just a fun story to tell. And I did ultimately use some of the notes that I wrote in the prison in the story and maybe even in the podcast. But then I was able to talk to him a bunch. And then he got out he was still in prison when we started Campside. I think he was even still in prison when I decided to start making the podcast, but I knew he was getting out. And he got out right before Christmas 2019. So I guess we were just in the process of starting the company, but we were already working on Con Queen, for instance.
The fact that he was, I guess when you first encountered the story, a solo operator, as you understood it, and he was known for this mask that he would wear, but it wasn't actually a mask. And you'd done a lot of stories about crews that robbed banks. Was that part of what drew you in, is like this sort of individual character study? And then how long did it take you to realize it was a crew in a strange way?
Yeah, he was. I was interested in the like lone wolf perfectionist, because it strikes me that there's 2 very distinct types of bank robbery. Either you're in a gang, either it's point break, or you're like on your own, which is the more common type. And as I learned, like the most common type of bank robbery is a crime of convenience or desperation. It's usually like a drug addict who just desperately needs money to score, so they run into a bank and almost always get caught. This was pretty unique to have an individual who did it 30 times. And one of the craziest things I learned early on was he only stole like $76,000 or something. So he robbed 30 banks, every one a federal crime, which could have put him away for a number of years, in exchange for a couple $100, maybe $3,000 at a time, which obviously was because he was fueling an addiction. But that's a tremendous amount of risk for not a lot of return. Business school risk assessment it would not be a good case study to business school. Should I start robbing banks for this return? But I learned, and I didn't really write much of this in the magazine story, the first bank he actually robbed with his son, Conner, who in the podcast becomes like the co-star almost. Not almost, really is. For a bunch of reasons that got downplayed in the magazine story. Partly because he was, at that time, Conner, who I'm happy to report now is doing well, was struggling still, and I didn't really want to subject him to the media. I just felt like this was Tony's story. Of course, I need to mention that he robbed his first bank with his son, but the terrible, tragic conclusion to that chapter is that after they robbed their first bank, Conner gets arrested and Tony doesn't. And Conner, his son, goes to prison and Tony doesn't. And it's the part of the podcast where Tony gets understandably most emotional, and also where he's like, I realize this is where I'll lose a lot of people. People will hate me forever. But also one of the most poignant parts, I think, because when I talked to both him and Conner about it, they told separately, and I did interview them separately, they told me the same thing, which was, I didn't trust the other person to be able to survive on his own. So basically, I guess I forgot this part. Conner had also gotten addicted to heroin, not with his dad. He's more of the typical like rebellious teen, starts experimenting with drugs, ends up taking pills. Pills lead to heroin. And in fact, when Tony makes his transition from OxyContin to heroin, it's because Conner, his son, recognizes him as dope sick one day and says, I have something I can do to help you. You should try heroin. And I realize in the abstract, if anyone's just listening to this for the first time, having never heard the story, that's crazy. So it's like, so this teenage son introduces his dad to heroin and they start using together. And then they rob a bank together and the son gets arrested and the dad doesn't. Like, those objective facts are tragic and terrible and shocking, I think. But what the podcast did is enabled me to talk to them both through that whole crazy, in some ways, inexcusable chapter for Tony. In other ways, like, when you hear his explanation, he was like, we were both had a crippling addiction to heroin. I thought if I left Conner on his own, he would die. Conner says to me, I thought if I left my dad on his own, he would die. So we were stronger together. And they were homeless together, and they were using drugs together, and they decided to rob a bank together. And for a bunch of reasons, including Tony's poor health, Conner's the one that runs in and robs the bank. He had a mask on, but he's still identified later. One of his gloves turns up with DNA in it. So they have him dead to rights, basically, and they had no evidence on Tony. So Tony's left with a choice, which is, I can either just admit it and go to prison with my kid, or I cannot admit it and try and stay out and get my life cleaned up so I can help him get out of prison or be a better dad when he gets out. Again, like, what, talk about a terrible decision to have to make. What is the point of going to prison just to fall on your sword? Because it wasn't like him giving himself up gets the son out. Conner was going to prison no matter what. It wasn't a real weapon, but he carried a fake gun in, and I guess they don't make a distinction. If the teller thinks it's a real gun, then it's an armed robbery. And he had colored the tip of the gun, which is usually orange, black. So it was essentially an armed robbery charge. Conner was not getting out. So to the extent that he had a gang, it was the two of them, and they failed horribly on their first effort. Conner goes to prison. And that's really what sets Tony on kind of the nihilistic spiral that he becomes like a serial bank robber and didn't care what happened to himself. He was fueling his addiction and ultimately gets caught and it saves his life. But I think at the time he probably thought, I'm going to do this until I die. I'll get shot by a cop or I'll overdose.
Obviously, this father-son storyline became, I think, a big part of what the audience responded to. It made the podcast special. How did you juggle telling what is in essence three kinds of stories? You had a heist story, you had an opioid story, and then you had a father-son story. Like, when you approached the podcast as a writing exercise, how'd you decide like where and when to structure those things?
I ultimately told it sort of chronologically, but I knew Conner would be a much bigger character. But I did that thing where we started at the end and then we build back up to it, which is a very common TV structure, where we ended with the arrest, rock bottom. I remember getting notes from Apple, and one of their only notes was like, we're giving too much away. Like, why are we giving the ending away at the beginning? We need to raise the stakes. And one way I explained that we're not doing that, I was like, there's a big twist coming, which is that like he robs banks with his own son who he was using heroin with. Like that, you're not even learning that in the first episode. So I held that back and I started with, this is the story of the one guy. And then rewound to the beginning and told Tony's descent. But by, I think, somewhere in episode 2, you learn about Conner. And then it becomes this like briefly tragic buddy heist project. And then episode 3, I believe, is the heist where they rob the bank together. And I remember we had a lot of discussion about this, where it's almost like we overuse this term, but like a Coen Brothers tragic comedy, like, because it was funny, the facts of what happened, which is when Conner, I can laugh about this now because Conner's fine. He's out of prison. Tony's fine. He's out of prison. when he ran out of the bank, the dye pack exploded. And as he himself told me, he was like one of those stunt planes at an air show. So he's like running down the sidewalk in broad daylight with like red smoke trailing off the back of himself, and he's covered in red paint. And Tony is like across the street in a car watching his own son. And of course, in that moment, I'm sure Tony is like horrified and terrified. In retrospect, they were laughing about it because Tony's like, oh, I think this is going pretty well. He got out the door, no one's chasing him. And then suddenly there's like an explosion and he's bright red. And then he's literally running toward the getaway car, trailing red smoke. Like, it's an absurd set piece. And so we did that episode as like kind of funny. And then, of course, it ends with a not funny at all revelation that Connor's going to prison and Tony's not. That's Tony's rock bottom, which is, I don't care anymore. Now I'm addicted to heroin. My son's in prison. I should be getting myself straight, but I'm just going to rob banks and like be a nihilist. And the series I thought would end at the arrest. And this is, I guess, the other part of it, which is that I thought we would start at the end, tell the story and build back up to the end. But then we continued on past it because he got out of prison during the pandemic and moves in with Connor. So we picked their story back up and they live as roommates trying to rebuild their lives. And it's during the pandemic, so they can't find work and they're not allowed out in public and they start drinking. And you start to worry that they're going to relapse and it's all going to end tragically. And fortunately, they both stopped drinking. And it had a happy ending of sorts, although not completely. Connor's doing really well. Tony's still not working. And he's a relentlessly optimistic guy for someone who's been through all this. But I wish I could say he was doing better.
Well, in that part of the podcast towards the end there where you could hear that come through, even you as we always think of the host or the journalist as being purely objective in these things, but obviously it's more about like transparency or stated subjectivity, right? But at what point does it get hard to have that remove when you start to care about somebody? And I think you even stated in the podcast you were worried about his drinking, right? It's like, how do you juggle getting to know someone this well and telling their story while also trying to keep that step back?
Yeah. Well, I was going to say it's hard. It's not really hard because it's only hard if you buy into the idea of journalistic objectivity, which I don't really believe in. I think you need to be honest with the audience. You should be as transparent as you can be, but I don't know that anyone expects you. To me, it's weird, especially in that case. So I've been talking to him by that point for 3 years, all the time. And during the pandemic, this is the early days of Campside. I had more time. He's just stuck at home. We would talk like every other day or sometimes like at least once a week, sometimes 3 times a week. I got to know him really well. And so the idea that I could be objective and I wouldn't care, like how callous would I have to be if I was just like, oh, this guy's not doing well. It's going to make a great podcast. That's all I care about. I definitely started to care about him and Connor, and I'd met them in person and I was like invested in their success. And I just think it's silly for us to expect journalists to not care, right? Now, like I think there's a debate to be had about what you should do in that situation. Do you become proactive in their livelihood? Should I be like calling references or trying to find him an apartment? Maybe if I know people there and I can be helpful, but I don't think it's my job to solve the problems for him. I think it's my job to be empathetic and care about how these people turn out, because for a lot of reasons, including that I think when people have the faith and trust in a journalist to tell their story, it's a pretty unbelievable thing to do, to open your life to someone and just trust that they're going to tell it in a way that, I don't know, that you're going to be happy with is probably the wrong term, but not feel burned by. And I think you see all the time subjects of stories and documentaries and podcasts say that they're burned. Like they're either, you took my words out of context, I didn't think you were going to write about that. Or here was a situation where Tony from the beginning was basically like, I think part of his therapy restitution, whatever he was dealing with, was like, I can't change the things I did, but I'm not going to apologize for them. And I'm going to tell my story warts and all. And hopefully it's a cautionary tale for other people. Maybe it makes members of my family forgive me, whatever his reasons. And so I was really thankful to him for that, because it resulted in a really moving project. But also, like, I did care. Like, I still care. I think we're going to talk a little bit about what he's been up to since. And like, I'm invested in his success and bummed about his failures. And I care that Connor and Connor's son, or that Connor's clean, and that Tony's grandson, Connor's son, who's named Anthony Jr. after Tony, are doing well, right? Like, I think maybe there's someone out there who can do a project and just close the chapter and move on, but I can't, especially when you spend that much time with somebody. So yeah, I'm totally subjectively invested in his well-being.
Well, and I think that came through, right? Like that level of honesty and what that created from your perspective, but also from Tony's, is what the audience responded to. I think we saw right away. Remember, we they tell you don't look at the comments, but we of course read the reviews and things like that. And you look at the comments on Apple Podcasts, and we started to see right away there was just a totally different reaction than the normal podcast, right? And that had to have come from that transparency, that honesty, that vulnerability, the warts and all. Speak about that a little bit.
Yeah, I think you're right. It's generally good advice to never read the comments. And I remember on Con Queen having this discussion with Vanessa where she's like, never read the comments. I'm like, don't worry, I don't. And then the next day she came in and was like suggesting edits based on the comments. I was like, you told me not to read the comments. What are you doing? And she's like, I know, I can't help it. And this is a case where I don't think, I think I didn't start doing it. I think Mark McAdam and Elizabeth Van Brocklin, who worked on this with me and deserve just as much credit as I do. I think maybe Elizabeth had been reading them and was like, you really should start looking at the comments. And I was like, are you sure? Because usually it's, that guy sucks. This is boring. 1 star. They weren't like, and I'm not just saying this because they were like 5-star self-aggrandizing. It wasn't like this show is amazing. Josh is so talented. It was like Tony's story moved me. I'm like rooting for Tony and Conner. And like the most gratifying ones were things like, and there's a bunch of them. I just looked yesterday because I just talked to Tony, and I always tell him, like, if you're having a bad day, you should go and read the comments on the podcast because they're mostly like, I never understood the opioid epidemic until I listened to this show. There were a lot where like, my sister died of an overdose and I've always resented her. And now like, I need to think about it differently. Like I never took the time to understand how she got into that situation. And what Hook does is it really takes you inside the journey of the descent into addiction from someone who was on top, because I think it's very easy for us we've all known bad addicts probably, or certainly you hear about them on TV. We're like, oh, that guy probably had psychiatric problems, or he was a loser, he was a criminal. A lot of them, most addicts are not that, right? They didn't start out as addicts. They're somebody's brother, sister, husband, wife, mom, dad. And like this really showed you like, here's a guy who had it all and then went about as far as you can go without dying and came out the other side and had like kind of a positive message about it all. And so I think the comments are really reacting to that. Like a lot of people seem to just feel like it either changed their view of addiction or it helped them. I remember another one, a guy was like, now I have something I can send to my parents who to like hope that they can understand that I'm not just some loser, right? Like I didn't choose to become a heroin addict for fun. And that's for me, I feel like I knew a lot about the opiate epidemic, but the biggest switch for me was like truly understanding, and this will be obvious to anyone who's been an addict or known somebody, was that it's heroin and opiates specifically is not about a high. It's about evading the low. So all addicts, opiate addicts, are terrified of dope sickness. So your entire life, I remember Tony describing it to me as soon as you fix up, you basically click the stopwatch and you're like, watch exactly how long it's going to take until the nausea starts to set in and the muscle aches start to. So your entire life is based around a schedule of getting to the next fix to fight off sickness. And when you reframe addiction in that sense, it's not just like someone who just wants to party and like skip work and hang out. They're trying to avoid the worst feeling that you can possibly have. And it's so powerful that you will do anything, including rob banks. When you think of it that way, it changes the way that you look at opiate addicts. And so I think the comments really reflect that. Again, it's like it has much less to do with me than it has to do with Tony and Conner being willing to just say it, to let me into their lives and observe it and be like, this is what it looks like, warts and all. And it's because they're charming and funny and vulnerable. They were just so 3-dimensional, and people like empathized with them in a way they probably haven't with many addicts. And if you didn't know somebody, it'll help. And if you did and you resented them or you looked down on them, I think hopefully it changed your mind about that.
And then what do you think is the next step in this evolution of people understanding this? Like to your point, like there became a cultural understanding of what this drug does and some of the villains behind it. And I think people are coming around to understanding that it's not chasing a high, it's fending off the low. But when do we get to the point where society writ large forgives these people, lets them have another chance? It's almost like someone getting out of prison and you're trying to say, look, they have a clean slate, they have a fresh start, but the powers that be, the bureaucracy, the gatekeepers, they don't let them. And it seems like that's happening to these folks, including Tony, right?
Definitely. I think there's a sort of scarlet letter stigma associated with it. Like, I think probably addiction on its own, like, especially if you've lost a job or had to go to rehab, there's a good chance that you're going to have to explain that for the rest of your life and people are going to think less of you for it. Throw in prison and like the scarlet letter is like tattooed on your forehead. One of the sad parts of the story is that prison in theory is supposed to rehabilitate people, right? I think that's the operating theory behind it. You take dangerous or problematic people out of society, you put them away for a while as punishment and in theory to protect society. But also what you're supposed to do is give them a second chance. And it's not really how it works, I think. And that's another lesson for me in this. And obviously I did know this to some degree. I've heard there's a lot of, well, not a lot, probably not enough, but there are people out there who advocate for this and try and help ex-cons re-enter society. But usually they come out and they do like road crew or they work construction, or not that those are bad jobs, but if you're a guy like Tony, if you're a white collar, he wasn't a white collar criminal, but before he had 21 years of engineering experience at Boeing. That's a very qualified person who then is probably willing to take a job that may even like several levels below what he's qualified for, but he would have happily taken that job. But the reality is those companies don't want to hire someone who went to prison for bank robbery. And you can understand why they might be concerned about it. But if we believe in the idea that people can change and that they can be rehabilitated, and especially when you understand the narrative of every case should be different, right? Like you don't want to hire back someone who's still violent, who's still robbing banks. But if this was an addiction thing and you've been clean for 10 years and you're smart and you had this great resume, shouldn't I give you another chance? He came very close to getting a job at Boeing. And I had said during the show, I think it's even in the series, and if it's not, I remember talking to Mark about it, saying like the best ending for this story would be Boeing hires him back. It doesn't have to be his exact job, but he gets an engineering job at Boeing. And talk about a company that needs good PR, right? Like one of America's great companies, which keeps falling on its face. They've trapped astronauts in space. The planes are falling out of the sky. Whistleblower named Josh Dean kills himself.
Not you, to be clear.
No, but everyone thought it was me. There's almost no media story in the past 10 years that has been sent to me more than Boeing whistleblower Josh Dean committing suicide in Oklahoma. I'm here.
You could argue Boeing needs good engineering too, not just good press.
Exactly. So PR and engineering, two things Tony represents. But he got into the job application process, went so far as to get a job offer, and then they ran a third-party background check on him, which of course turned up an extensive criminal record, which he had been honest about, and they rescinded the offer. And he's been fighting ever since to try and get it explained or reversed. But it just shows you that someone who has done time, who owned his mistakes, has a great resume, is clean, as he says, hasn't even had a parking ticket since he got out. Even that guy can't get a job. Like, what hope is there for other inmates? Like, it's just, or not inmates, ex-cons, because they're out. It's depressing, honestly.
Well, and obviously in the TV show version, maybe the happy ending, you create it and maybe that manifests. But I think that leads to an incredible writer-director, John Ridley, who did 12 Years a Slave, American Crime, lots of amazing stuff. He was involved at the article stage, right? In terms of adapting it. Tell people how that all came together.
Yeah, the magazine story itself, even before the podcast came out, it resonated quite a bit. It was like somewhat viral. And then there was a good bit of film and TV interest even before we made the podcast. And yeah, John Ridley, a filmmaker, writer who I respect a lot, he had reached out to me personally in a way that I've since learned at Campsite happens. I wouldn't have thought it happens. You think like you would hear from their representatives, but he had just been like, I guess he reads Business Week every morning. He's like, I love this story. What are you going to do with it? Started talking, and I ended up picking him over a number of writer directors who'd reached out and began the process of trying to adapt it. And that carried on into Campsite. And then when we decided to do the podcast for Apple, it was with the understanding that hopefully Apple would want to make the TV show because John Ridley was attached. He had a plan, I think, originally to do a limited series. And then I think he then recast it a little bit to be a 2-season thing because he felt like there could be a before and after. I can't remember his exact creative execution, but Apple ultimately passed on it, which is not no shade at Apple. That happens all the time, as we've learned. Like more projects don't get made. Most projects don't get made. But it was a bummer because Ridley, to this day, remains completely passionate about this story. And what he told me the first time I talked to him, and what he still tells me today, I talked to him last week, he's a father himself. The relationship between Tony and Conner made so much sense to him because he's like, I would do anything for my son too, right? And sometimes you don't know what the limits of that may be. Like Tony experienced basically the limits, Would you live in a Subaru shooting heroin with your son in order to keep him alive and then rob a bank in order to fend off dope sickness? I don't think any of us, I'm a father, you're a father, we have sons. Like when we're thinking of the things we might have to go through with our son, that's not really a scenario we've ever probably, like a thought experiment we've done. Would I do the same thing? But I think Ridley listened to it, read it, I guess, the first time, and then listened to the podcast and was like, I'm so moved by this. It's really a story of a father and a son. And so he very much was going to tell the story of this relationship. Sadly, we kind of ran into the dope sick problem. A journalist named Beth Macy wrote a great book called Dope Sick, which Hulu made into a limited series that got nominated for some Emmys. And Hollywood being often not the most, I don't know, is open-minded, the right, whatever it is.
Flexible
Place. They're just sort of like, oh yeah, somebody did the opiate thing. And Ridley's like, wait, what? But this is so different. Dope Sick is about rural Virginia, about pill mills, about how oxy ravaged rural America. Very important. This is completely different. Yes, it's the opiate epidemic, but it's about a father-son. It's about bank robbery. It's far more cinematic. It's bleak at times, but it's not always bleak. And Dope Sick is just pretty bleak to the core. But unfortunately, we just ran into that problem. I think we all still hope there will be a time when it won't matter anymore. Ridley remains committed to it, and hopefully maybe someone will listen to this and want to make a TV show.
Yeah, it was a victim of timing in that sense, where a similar project had occurred and suddenly we've done that now. We don't need to do another one. It's that level of bureaucracy, the same thing Tony's up against in trying to get a job back at Boeing. Like there's these big systems, I think, that loom and shift, and sometimes you can't overcome them. The best you can do is drill down and tell one individual great story, which you did. And thanks for sharing with us, Josh.
All right. Well, nice to meet you, Adam.
Yes, great to meet you as well. A real honor. I've been a fan of your work for many years.
Thanks so much to Josh and the rest of the Hook team. And thank you for listening to Inside the Tent. If you haven't already, don't forget to go to joincampside.com to become a free member of the Campside community. That's joincampside.com.